requirement that I file by April 1st so that the appropriators can get started. The Budget Control Act...
You can see the rest of Senator Conrad's briefing on our website. Go to cspan.org. We're leaving it as senators returning from their weekly party lunches. We'll go live now to the Senate floor where Senator Conrad is offering remarks.
At the levels agreed to by Democrats and Republicans in last summer's Budget Control Act. It allows the appropriations committees to now proceed with their work in drafting bills for next year. And it ensures that the Senate will have the tools to enforce the spending limits we agreed to on a bipartisan basis. I want to emphasize to my colleagues that we do have a budget. Those who continue to claim that we do not have a budget are either unaware of what they voted on last year or are seeking to deliberately mislead the public. The Budget Control Act was passed by the House of Representatives, was passed by the United States Senate, and signed into law by the President. It is the law of the land, and it established the key components of the budget for 2012 and 2013. Mr. President, here is the language from the Budget Control Act itself. It is very clear that the Budget Control Act is intended to serve as the budget for 2012 and 2013. It states, and I quote, "For the purpose of enforcing the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 through April 15th of 2012, the allocations, aggregates, and levels set in subsection B1 shall apply in the Senate in the same manner as for a concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2012. It goes on to use that exact same language for fiscal year 2013. In many ways, the Budget Control Act was even more extensive than a traditional budget. It has the force of law, unlike a budget resolution that is not signed by the President. I think most members here know a budget resolution is purely a congressional document. The Budget Control Act is actually the law. Number two, the Budget Control Act set discretionary spending caps for 10 years instead of the 1 year normally set in a budget resolution. Three, it provided enforcement mechanisms, including 2 years of deeming resolutions, which allow budget points of order to be enforced. And four, it created a reconciliation-like supercommittee process to address entitlement and tax reforms. And it backed that process with a $1.2 trillion sequester. So these claims that we do not have a budget can now be put to rest. By filing the deeming resolution provided for in the Budget Control Act this morning, the budget levels have been set for next year. Last week, we received CBO's updated budget estimates, which allowed me to complete work on the budget deeming resolution for 2013. The filing of this deeming resolution was required under the Budget Control Act. I filed a similar resolution for 2012 back in September. And the Budget Control Act is crystal clear that the spending limits in the resolution should be set at the levels agreed to in the Budget Control Act. Again, here is the language taken directly from the law. It states, and I quote, "Not later than April 15th of 2012, the chairman of the Committee on the Budget shall file for the Committee on Appropriations committee allocations for fiscal year 2012 and 2013 consistent with the discretionary spending limits set forth in this act." It doesn't say at a level below the limits set forth in this act. It says at a level consistent with the limits set forth in this act. And let's remember what these limits mean. Under the Budget Control Act, spending caps, discretionary spending is cut by about $900 billion below the CBO baseline over the next 10 years. And that is not including the sequester cuts. That is just the results of the Budget Control Act spending limits. Let me make clear, Mr. President, our House Republican friends now seem to be walking away from these levels, even though they agreed to them last year. Let's look at what they said last summer. Here's what House Budget Committee Chairman Ryan said on the House floor on August 1st. What the Budget Control Act has done is it has brought our two parties together. So I'd just like to reflect for a moment that we have a bipartisan compromise here. That doesn't happen all that often around here, so I think it's worth noting. That's a good thing. And what are we doing? We're actually cutting spending while we do this. That's cultural. That's significant. That's a big step in the right direction. We are getting two-thirds of the cuts we wanted in our budget, and as far as I'm concerned, 66% in the right direction is a whole lot better than going in the wrong direction. So, Mr. President, last summer our House Republican colleagues were pleased to be getting 66% of what they wanted. They made an agreement. They shook on it. They ought to keep the agreement that they made. And it seems that our House Republican friends are on their own, because at least so far, the Senate Republican leadership has agreed we should keep to the spending limits that we took on just last year. Here's what Senate Minority Leader McConnell said on the Senate floor last month, and I quote, "We have negotiated the top line for the discretionary spending for this coming fiscal year. We already have that number. There is no good reason for this institution not to move forward with an appropriation process that avoids what we have done so frequently under both parties for years and years, either continuing resolutions or omnibus appropriations. I hope we can join together and do the basic work of government this year and do it in a timely fashion." Mr. President, I hope so too. I hope our House Republican colleagues are listening. We still must come together on a budget plan that addresses the long-term fiscal imbalances that we confront, but the short-term budget is in place, and it is in law. It was included in the Budget Control Act that everyone agreed to last summer. It provided for about $900 billion in discretionary spending cuts. So the Senate is now poised to proceed with its business. I have filed the budget deeming resolution for 2013, and we will be moving forward with appropriations bills at the levels that we all agreed to. I believe House Republicans should do the same. If they fail to do so, they will once again threaten to shut down the government and needlessly imperil the economic recovery. Mr. President, I thank my colleagues for this time, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Kentucky.
I rise today in opposition to corporate welfare. At a time when our country is borrowing over $1 trillion a year, I think it makes no sense to loan money back to countries we are borrowing from. For example, we've borrowed $29 billion from Mexico, and yet we're sending them back $8 billion of the money we borrow from them to subsidize trade. A lot of the subsidized trade goes to very wealthy corporations. You know, when 12 million people are out of work in the United States, does it make sense for the U.S. taxpayer to subsidize loans of major multinational corporations? The President's big on saying, well, these rich companies need to pay their fair share. Well, why then is the President sending loans out to these very wealthy corporations and he's actually giving them their fair share of our taxpayer money? Why is that occurring? Now, I've often asked the question, is government inherently stupid? Well, you know, I don't think government's inherently stupid, but it's a debatable question. But what government is government doesn't get the same signals that your local bank gets. Your local bank has to look at your credit worthiness. Your local bank has to make a profit. Your local bank has to meet a payroll. But once the government gets in charge of these things, Katie bar the door. We don't have a good track record with government banks because they don't feel deep inside the same pain that an individual banker feels when he gives a loan. So we've got Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac losing $6 billion a quarter of your money. And what do they want to do? They want to expand another government bank. So get this right. The Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that are government banks are losing $6 billion a quarter. Just recently, they wanted to give them multi-million-dollar bonuses. And they said, well, you got to pay people if you want to keep good talent. You know, my question is how much talent does it take to lose $6 billion a quarter? I think there are people here today watching the Senate that would take $19 million a year to run one of these government banks. To have your only record be that you lose $6 billion a quarter, that's outrageous. And they're wanting to expand a new government bank and give money to very wealthy corporations that are making a profit. It makes no sense whatsoever. Now, Jefferson said that government is best that governs least. Now, what did he mean by that? He meant that he wanted government to be small because government is inherently inefficient. Government doesn't get the same signals. That's why we should only let government do the things that the private sector can't do. Banking is something the private sector can do. We're not talking about starting new companies for the most part. We're mostly talking about subsidizing very wealthy multinational companies. With the startup companies, though, let's look at the companies that the Export-Import Bank is subsidizing. One of them is called First Solar. Now, you may have heard that a lot of these solar companies are big contributors to President Obama. I wonder if that has something to do with them getting loans. But here's the loan that First Solar gets from Export-Import. You know what? They get paid, and they have a loan that says that they're going to make solar panels, and then who's going to buy the solar panels? Themselves. So they made a deal with another company they own, and the taxpayer stuck financing a loan so First Solar can make solar panels and then buy them from themselves. Well, that sounds like a good deal. You get the government to subsidize a loan to buy your own product. Who else were we subsidizing? We gave $10 million in loans to Solyndra. You may have heard of Solyndra. Solyndra is owned by the 20th richest man in the United States, who just happens to be a big contributor to President Obama. Coincidence? I don't know. Guess who works for the Department of Energy? Solyndra's lawyer, her husband works for the Department of Energy, and he was apparently a big fan of these loans and a big fan of restructuring these loans. Do you think people approving the loans should be related to the people getting the loans? Robert Kennedy Jr. from the famous Kennedy family, they got $1.8 billion. Just so happens they're big supporters of the president politically also. How did they get the loan? Somebody who used to work for Kennedy now works in the loan department at the Department of Energy. Sounds like there might be a conflict of interest. This is a real problem, but this is a problem that's endemic to government banks. Once you let the government get hold of the banks, and once you let them make the loan decisions, they do it and they give the money to their favorites. So when one party's in charge, their favorites get it. When the other party's in charge, their favorites get it. The government shouldn't be in this business. These are large multinational corporations that can find loans for themselves. Guess what? Sometimes they're loaning money to other governments that then compete with our industry. We are loaning money to India, who we also owe billions of dollars, but then India subsidizes an airline that competes with U.S. airlines. Doesn't make any sense at all. But we continue to do things that are counterproductive, counterintuitive, at your expense. And then we say, well, to keep good talent, we got to pay these guys millions of dollars to run these government banks. The problem is government banks don't respond the way business does. They respond in a fashion where they don't really feel the pain. No one loses their job. No one loses a night's sleep over a government loan. When a bank loans you money, someone has to make a profit and meet a payroll. It's different. You have the checks and balances of the marketplace. You don't need to have the government involved here. So there are a couple of questions we should ask before doing what the other side wants to do, and they want to expand the size of this corporate welfare. They want more corporate welfare going out to multinational corporations. And in doing so, they want you, the taxpayer, to be on the hook for more money. So I would say we have to ask some questions. Should we be dispensing loans based on political favoritism? Should it matter if you're a big contributor to the president? Should that matter in getting a loan? No, I think that ought to be illegal. If it's not immoral, it ought to be. It is immoral. It should be illegal. We shouldn't be doing that. And then the other question is, does it make sense to send billions of dollars to borrow it first from China or India and then to send it back to them and say, please buy our products with it? So we borrow the money from it and then we send them back to the very same companies. It makes utterly no sense. So what I would ask is that the Senate consider very seriously whether at a time when we're running a $1 trillion deficit, it makes sense to be subsidizing profitable, large, multinational corporations. I don't think so, and I don't think the taxpayer thinks so. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back my time.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, over the last several days, there has been an immense outpouring of concern about the so-called jobs bill that the House has sent to us. And this outpouring should weigh upon us. It should make us question the speed and the lack of deliberation with which we are considering this House bill, and question the wisdom of just sending it back to the House if there is one amendment to it, which is on the Ex-Im Bank, and hoping that somehow or other that investors are going to be protected in a conference instead of by the United States Senate. What we are considering today should be done with great deliberation. We should take the time to get this right. The House Majority Leader suggested yesterday that those of us who are concerned about the House bill are, quote, creating phantom investor protection issues, close quote. We did not create these issues. People who know far more about capital markets than the House Majority Leader, or myself, or probably any of us, have asked us to reconsider what we are poised to do. Start with the Council of Institutional Investors. This group's members invest a combined $3 trillion in our nation's capital markets. They include the nation's largest pension funds, university endowments, and foundations. The Council of Institutional Investors, an outside, independent, objective group that's sole purpose in life is to make sure that investors are given sound opportunities and are not defrauded. They are warning us that rather than boosting investment in our economy, that we could frighten investors out of the market. They are asking us, they are pleading with us to reevaluate, and we should. And now, next, take a look at the letter from the current SEC Chairman, Mary Schapiro, to the Banking Committee last week. Chairman Schapiro issues a lengthy list of warnings about provisions in the House bill. She sums up her warnings this way, quote, if the balance is tipped to the point where investors are not confident that there are appropriate protections, investors will lose confidence in our markets and capital formation will ultimately be made more difficult and expensive, close quote. Well, that's precisely the opposite of the impact that we should want. And we should listen to the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, which warns us that the House bill, quote, would create marketplace and investor confusion, close quote, that dampens rather than strengthens investment in growing companies. And we should listen to the associations, or the association that represents state securities administrators. What does that association do? They warn us that, quote, Congress is on the verge of enacting policies that, although intended to strengthen the economy, will in fact only make it more difficult for small businesses to access investment capital, close quote. We should listen to the editors of Bloomberg News, one of the most trusted sources of commentary on the markets, who tell us that provisions of the House bill, quote, would be dangerous for investors and could harm already fragile financial markets, close quote. Now, Mr. President, can any of us who have lived through the fearful days of the financial crisis, days when we wondered if the entire economy would crumble, can any of us, or should any of us, vote to rush through this body legislation that threatens harm to fragile financial markets? Do we really want to live through that again? We should amend this flawed House bill so that we can create opportunity for American workers, companies, and investors, and not opportunities for fraudsters, boiler room hucksters, and con artists. We can do that, and we should do that. One way to do that is to invoke cloture on the alternative that Senators Jack Reed, Landrieu, and I have offered, and to begin debate and amendments on that alternative so that the Senate's deliberative process can begin. If that cloture vote fails, the only remaining prudent alternative is to reject the cloture motion on the underlying bill so that the Senate can begin to deliberate and consider amendments to a bill that has aroused such concern among so many experts, whose very job it is to protect consumers. Now, some may fear that by slowing a runaway train, that they risk being portrayed as hostile to job creation or to small businesses. After all, how can we oppose legislation titled the Jobs Act? Well, it takes more than a clever acronym to create jobs. And as the astonishing amount of concern among market experts tells us, this Jobs Act, this so-called Jobs Act, is not a Jobs Act, but an invitation to the kind of fraud that destroys jobs. The Senate, the U.S. Senate, is the place where care and deliberation are supposed to rule and are supposed to rein in the excesses of haste and incaution. And I urge my colleagues to undertake that responsibility today. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kaka.
The Senate debating a small business bill. It lets them raise funds from certain investors over the Internet. It also changes regulations if they want to go public. Coming up in a little over an hour from now, senators plan a number of votes to move the bill forward and to limit debate on a couple of amendments. House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan released his budget proposal today. The Washington Post writes that House Republicans laid down a bold but risky election year marker, unveiling a budget proposal that aims to tame the national debt by reshaping Medicare and cutting deeply into Medicaid, food stamps, and other programs for the poor, while reshuffling the tax code to sharply lower rates. The article goes on to say that congressional Republicans plan to use the document to demonstrate their willingness to tackle the nation's difficult fiscal problems head-on. In about 50 minutes from now at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, a number of votes, including limiting debate on a couple of amendments. One of those, by Rhode Island Democrat Jack Reed, would limit small businesses' ability to delay rules compliance. And about the budget plan, House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan released today, a roll call writes, in a reprise of the Medicare wars triggered by last year's budget debates, a senior citizen and civil rights advocates announced a grassroots lobbying and ad campaign assailing Chairman Ryan's budget. The groups held a rally outside the American Enterprise Institute, where the Wisconsin Republican presented his budget plan this morning, waving black and yellow signs that read, "Hands off my Medicare" and "Hands off my Medicaid." Organizers at the event pledged to revive the town hall meetings that followed Congressman Ryan's release last year of the budget plan that would have partially privatized Medicare. That in roll call this afternoon.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I will ask unanimous consent to be able to speak in morning business for up to 10 minutes.